This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. In our March Military History Night, Pat Hind-White brings us Victoria-based author, military historian, and battlefield guide Susan Raby-Dunne, speaking to us about John Mccrae, the author of the immortal poem In Flanders Fields. Pat and Susan, over to you.
All right. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Patricia Hind-White, and I organize this event. Welcome to RCMI's virtual military history night, Wednesday, March the 9th, 2022. This presentation will be videotaped for educational purposes. There will be a question and answer period following the presentation, and if you'll mute your mics and hold questions until that time. Guest speaker, Susan Raby-Dunne, and her topic, John Mccrae in Flanders Fields. Our speaker, who lives in Victoria, British Columbia, is a Canadian author, military historian, and battlefield guide, giving tours in Belgium, Netherlands, France, and Italy. She's written 8 books about World War I and World War II, including 2 about John Mccrae. She has also written a motorcycle memoir about her so far 4 decades plus of motorcycle touring. Additionally, she is presently working on a new book that tells the story of First World War soldier Red Dutton, who overcame crippling wounds to become an NHL National Hockey League star when he returned to Canada. Tonight, I invite you to join Susan Raby-Dunne for an examination of a famous soldier, physician, and poet with what began as an interest in 2005 and became an ongoing obsession as she followed Lieutenant Colonel John Mccrae's footsteps from Canada through the battlefields of Flanders to France, where he died and is buried. So without further ado, a warm welcome, and Susan, virtually speaking, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, I call my presentation The Real Mccrae because I realized when I started studying him that people had all kinds of misconceptions about who he was and what he did and where he was. And I just thought that's what I'd call it because I really dive into all those things. I like this colorized picture of him. You can see his bright blue eyes. So one of the first things I discovered upon studying Mccrae is that he had a close relationship with this guy, Major General Sir Edward Morrison. And they'd actually met as young artillery lieutenants in the South African War. And when I study people, I usually look at these peripheral characters. And so I tried to do some searching on Edward Morrison. And in 2006, there was almost nothing to be found about him. I guess there was a huge resurgence in interest in World War I beginning back then, because now you can find quite a bit of stuff. But back then, the first thing that came up was this handwritten copy of In Flanders Fields, and apparently he carried a copy of that in his breast pocket throughout the war. Another really influential person in Mccrae's life was Sir William Osler, and I'm sure most of you have heard of him. He's widely considered the father of modern Western medicine, and he was a mentor of Mccrae's. So here's John Mccrae on the left, on the stairs here at the bottom left. Sir William Osler sitting on the bottom step, his wife Grace. And then up here is John Mccrae's brother Tom, who was also a physician and also served in World War I in a hospital. And then the little guy on the railing, he'll be really important later on in this story. He was Sir William Osler's only son, Edward Revere Osler. Osler's wife was Grace Revere. She was American and was actually related to Paul Revere. And a lot of people called him Revere, but Sir William himself called him Ike. That was his nickname for his son. So here they are, they're on holiday at a cottage somewhere in Quebec, and Mccrae is with them. So he got a kind of a prestigious appointment to Johns Hopkins College when he finished university, U of T. He graduated U of T with a gold medal, top of his class, and got this prestigious internship under Sir William Osler in Baltimore. Except when the South African War broke out, he dropped everything to go to the South African War, which absolutely astounded everyone. They were just flabbergasted that he would have done this, and a lot of people were really angry about it, but he couldn't be dissuaded, so off he went to the South African War. And now, what a lot of people may not have known is that his father, David, on the left here, was a lifelong artillery enthusiast. He was always in the militia, always brushing up on his artillery skills. He was in the Fenian Wars and saw a little bit of action there. And when World War I broke out, he raised his own artillery battery, which he planned to lead himself, but of course he was refused because he was 73 years old at the time. So I just love this picture of the two of them, though. They're like a mirror image of each other, the way they're standing with their hands behind their backs and one leg kind of open. Yeah, they're like a mirror image. So we can see where Mccrae got his interest in the artillery. So here he is on Metcalfe Street in Ottawa in January 1900. It was probably about 30 below, because these soldiers look bundled up, and he's leading them down Metcalfe Street to the train, and then they're going to be getting on the train and heading off to get a ship from Halifax to South Africa. So he commanded his own section of D Battery, the right section, and the left section of D Battery was commanded by Edward Morrison. So they met over there and became lifelong friends. So here he is in Cape Town, and if you could see this picture, it's 120 years old, but he's got an ear-to-ear grin. He's just so thrilled to be going into battle here with his battery in South Africa. And here he is with a chaplain. He's in the middle, and Morrison on the right. So they went into Cape Town. They went to the Lord Nelson Inn, and Morrison did a bit of hunting there. There he is with his first springbok. So they heard that Rudyard Kipling was around. So they found him in the lobby of this hotel in Cape Town. And they were in a corner kind of whispering, should we go talk to him? And anyway, he eventually came over and introduced himself to them and said that he knew they were Canadians by their cursing, which is kind of funny. So anyway, that was the first time they met Rudyard Kipling. They actually met him again on Salisbury Plain. He had dinner with them. And he was always a fan of the Canadians. So he went to war, and in my opinion, he didn't get he didn't get the cure. And to me, the cure is actual combat that really tests a person right to the ground. He, for some reason, got sent off on these long, pointless marches across the Karoo, freezing to death. The horses didn't have adequate food, which infuriated him. They got, not enough food, and what food they got was poor quality and moldy. And he only got in a couple of minor little scraps in the South African War, whereas Morrison actually got into some serious battles and kind of got out of one by the skin of his teeth and got a medal and everything. Mccrae, on the other hand, was guarding railway lines and doing everything but what he had trained for in the artillery. So he didn't get the cure in South Africa. So he came back to Montreal, and well, he came back, he eventually came to McGill. And Sir Andrew MacPhail was the editor of the paper at McGill University, and he published a lot of Mccrae's poetry and essays and short stories and things. So Mccrae became a pathology professor at McGill after the South African War. And here's another guy that was a friend of his, Stephen Leacock. So they had what they called the Pen and Pencil Club in Montreal. And they used to meet every 2 weeks, and they drink a little scotch. And I loved Leacock's dry humor. He said, and they would allow, with some reluctance, members to read their literary efforts. And also William Van Horn was a member as well. So it was quite a prominent group, but it was kind of a lark. You know, they just had a few drinks and read some poetry and probably had a few laughs. And so this was 1908. And Earl Grey, who's not in this picture, invited John Mccrae to be his expedition physician on quite a cool expedition out of Hudson Bay, up into the Arctic, and down the East Coast and back down the St. Lawrence. So here's Mccrae sitting down on the bottom here, and the guy to the right of him actually became an MP, I think, after this, Leo Amory, and he was also a writer. And Mccrae was quite a raconteur. He said that every night for 3 months, he would tell a different story around the campfire, and he never repeated himself one time. And they were always funny, colorful, interesting stories. So he was quite a storyteller. So this was their route. They came out of Norway House into Hudson Bay, down the Hudson Strait, all the way down the East Coast, in the inside of Newfoundland, around and then down back into the St. Lawrence. So it was a fantastic trip. At one point, they were in big freight canoes with First Nations people, and Mccrae really enjoyed them, their stories and their expertise with all the wildlife. And he was sort of a lifelong learner of everything, including natural history. So he absolutely loved that trip. So here he is in 1912, and at this point, he was a pathology professor. He had a private practice. He did rounds at 3 hospitals in Montreal. Oh, his private practice was kind of a bust as well, because if anybody couldn't pay, he would still treat them. He was very lax about running it in any kind of, fiscally sensible way at all, but it was kind of a testament to how kind he was. And then every 2 weeks, he would take the train down to the University of Vermont Medical School and lecture down there. So Stephen Leacock said his schedule would appall the stoutest of hearts. And then in the odd half hour, he would write poetry. So a lot of people think In Flanders Fields was his first poem, but it was actually, I think it was probably 30 the 32nd of 33 poems. He wrote one more after that before he died. So he always loved poetry and was dabbling in it since he was a teenager. Oops, where am I going that way? So he got on a ship, finally decided to take a holiday in the summer, and was going to go over and visit the Oslers at Oxford. At this time, Sir William Osler was the Dean of Medicine at Oxford Medical School. And he was halfway across when he got word that war had broken out. So the next thing that happened is he got a cable from Edward Morrison, who had been put in command of the 1st Brigade Canadian Field Artillery. And Morrison, he was immediate in inviting Mccrae to join him. He wanted him to be Major Second in Command, and then to satisfy the medical people, brigade surgeon as well. So he sort of had 2 hats when he joined the artillery for World War I. Now, a lot of people think he was in the Canadian Army Medical Corps, but he wasn't in the beginning. he was in the artillery, and he was on the artillery payroll, for even quite a while after they pulled him out of there. So I mentioned that I look at peripheral people. This was an exciting find of research. I decided to look at Dodds, because he mentioned Dodds all the time. He was often billeted with Dodds before and at the beginning of the first battle he was in. And I discovered, to my delight, there was quite a collection of photographs that Dodds had at University of Victoria. And that surprised me, because everything about Mccrae is in the East. But here was this great collection of photographs from World War I. So there was a scrapbook, and it's so dilapidated you can't even physically handle it. You have to look at it virtually. And I'm going through the scrapbook looking at these old clippings and letters and telegrams and stuff. And all of a sudden I see this picture. I just freaked out. And it said, 2 men in uniform. So even the people in charge of the collection at University of Victoria didn't know who it was. So I was just about to release my first book about Mccrae, and I just nonchalantly asked the curator if I could have that picture for my book. And he didn't even ask why, and I didn't tell him. I didn't want to get scooped. So once the book was out, then I told him straight away that you might want to know who those two guys are. One of them is John Mccrae, and the other one on the left is Dodds, for whom the collection is named. So that was the kind of thing that you live for when you're doing research. Yeah, and I love this picture of him. He was looking very rested and actually a little bit plump and just relaxed. And it was probably the first holiday and actual rest he'd had for years, because his schedule at university was crazy. So it was probably like summer camp at Camp Valcartier, because he would have caught up with Morrison and some of his colleagues from the militia. And it would have been a great time, I would say, while they were getting ready to ship out. And I was looking for pictures of horses getting ready to be loaded for transport to England. And I found a different one than this. And I tried to find the source of it. I think it was Queen's University. And they said, oh, we can't find that one, but we have another one. And I was kind of annoyed, because the other one I really liked. But when I got this one, I was pretty excited, because when I saw the name of the ship, SS Saxonia, that was their actual ship. The 1st Brigade Canadian Field Artillery had this whole ship to themselves to travel to England. So these are their actual horses and guns and materials. So it was very cool in the end to have gotten this photograph for my book. So they went to Salisbury Plain for training, and you may have heard that it was just, I think out of 125 days, it rained for 89. The winter of 1914-15. It was horrific. And this is the actual camp they were in, West Down North Camp, which is still a military camp. I tried to drive on here and I got turned away at the gate. They're like, nope, sorry, private. And you can see the red flag flying. So number one, it means entry's forbidden, because they do artillery drilling and shelling here. And the other thing is the wind. So they were on this open plain in high winds, wide open, lashing rain, just horrendous. I think about 200 of their horses, I think most of them had to be put down because they were dying of exposure. They were picketed out in the open in this area here. And at some point, they took them and picketed them in the trees to give them at least some shelter. And then they got in trouble for doing that. And they found out later that the landowners wanted to preserve those areas for fox hunting, which just infuriated Mccrae. He was always really concerned and conscientious about the welfare of horses specifically, but animals generally. So they were losing horses almost every day, and they were standing in water. it wasn't necessarily muddy, but underneath this grass here is chalk. So all that water was just sitting on the ground and the horses were standing in water. So like the horses got trench foot, like the men got trench foot once they got over to Europe, the horses were getting the equine equivalent of that, which was hoof rot. And their hoofs would basically come right off and they'd have to be put down. It was a disaster. So finally, the Mccrae and his brigade pooled their money and they rented a farm, New Copse Farm. And I found it too, but it's now in the forbidden area, so I couldn't go look there. But they finally got their horses in proper shelter and they recovered really quickly and really well. But they did lose, seems to me they lost upwards of 200 horses before they got that solved and had to do it with their own money. So this is on the left, Captain Cosgrave, Lawrence Moore Cosgrave, who was close with Morrison and served Morrison all the way through the war. And then here's one of the few pictures of John Mccrae on bonfire in the war. And I got this one from McRae House, and they didn't know where it was. They didn't know if it was in France or England. And that was another discovery I made while I was doing the research in England. I was walking around Devizes and I saw a sign for the Ark. And Mccrae had mentioned the Ark in his diary, that they billeted there, just to give themselves and their horses a break. Of course, the officers could do this. The men were stuck in tents and they didn't have that option. But anyway, I walked down this lane and there was the Ark. And it has modern flats flanking it. But this front part here, I started thinking, that looks familiar. And I went back and matched up the windows, and that's where they were. So it was one of their occasional billets in Devizes when they were on Salisbury Plain. So here they all are on the steps of their officers' mess, which was the Bear Hotel. And this was not too long before they shipped out. So here's Mccrae on the left. And, people that didn't think he was of a military mind or a, combatant mind. Here he is in his artillery uniform with a sidearm and a sword and the gunner's cap badge. Here's Morrison in the middle, and here's Cosgrave here. And then this guy holding the railing would become known not too long, a few months later, actually. This was Lieutenant Alexis Helmer. So here's Mccrae close up, and here's Helmer up here holding on to the railing. So I had a discussion with an English woman who wrote the first big biography of Mccrae, Diane Graves. She wrote a book in 1996 called A Crown of Life. And both of us had kind of strange coincidental things happen once we dove into our research about John Mccrae. And one of them for me was, I could go into long details of the things that happened when I was deep into this research, but I'll just tell you a couple. I was taking a course completely unrelated to World War I about the Neolithic sites on Salisbury Plain called the Avery Experience. And I assumed we'd be staying in Avebury. So I emailed the registrar and said, where are we staying in Avebury? And she goes, oh no, you're not going to be in Avebury. You're going to be in the Bear Hotel in Devizes. So I kind of got goosebumps because that was their officers' mess. So it was really exciting to stay there. And it's a fantastic hotel. Just loved it. And the other one was I was at a WordFest event in Alberta, and the author that was brought out to speak was Terry Follis. And some of you will know him. He's an Ontario political humorist. So at the end of his talk, which I wasn't planning to go to because that kind of writing's not my thing, but a girlfriend dragged me to it. But he was funny and interesting, and I was glad I went. At the end, I said, oh, I've got a book coming out shortly too about John Mccrae. And his face lit up and he said, my grandfather was a doctor and served under John Mccrae. at number 3 Canadian General Hospital, McGill in France. He says, in fact, when Mccrae died, he brought home one of Mccrae's spurs. Would you like to have it for your book launch? And I said, would I? So that's how that came to be in my possession for a couple of years. And then I convinced the Follis family to donate it to the Morrison Artillery Park and Museum in Ottawa. So that's where it is now in a display. So here's Alexis Helmer that I mentioned, who was on the steps there holding the railing, and it was his death that inspired John Mccrae to write In Flanders Fields. Oh, before they got into combat, though, when they were on the flank of the British, about this time, actually, tomorrow in 1915 was the beginning of the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in France. And Mccrae and his artillery brigade were just on the flank of the British, as were a few other Canadian infantry units, about 5 miles away from the actual fighting, just kind of getting used to trenches and how things worked. And Mccrae was out one day and ran into this guy. He was the Surgeon General at that time. And this guy was infuriated that Mccrae would have joined the artillery instead of the Canadian Army Medical Corps. And they had bad blood going right back to South Africa. So it may have had to do with what Mccrae had nothing but disgust for the Canadian Army Medical Corps in South Africa. He said, for filth and bad management, the hospitals there are a model. So you may know that more soldiers died of disease in South Africa than they did from the fighting, from dirty water and disease. So anyway, he ran into this guy in France in probably just about this time in 1915, and this guy attacked him. And he also threatened to take away Mccrae's horse. He said, medicals are not allowed to have mounts. And Mccrae had been gifted this horse by a colleague from McGill that he absolutely came to love. So he had that hanging over him for much of the beginning of the war. And so, I call him Mccrae's nemesis because he was just out to get him. He never got over his anger toward him for choosing the artillery. So I think Pat mentioned that I took my motorcycle over there in 2011 and kind of followed their footsteps as well as you could without being on horseback. I really wanted to get a sense of what they were looking at, what they were seeing, what they were smelling. So I just stopped at this town when I saw the sign, because this is one of the last places that they billeted, the second last place they billeted before going into their trial by fire in the second Battle of Ypres. So it's Flemish, but it's in France. It's part of French Flanders. And they were all billeted in this sort of pastoral farmland all around here. Next stop was Poppering. So Poppering is about 9 miles west of Ypres. And it was a hub for resupplying and for soldiers going to and from the front and going on leave. And it went from like 20,000 people to 150,000 during World War I. And it was like the Wild West. There was, houses of prostitution and gambling houses. And so it was pretty wild. And they were billeted here for probably, I don't think, quite a week leading up to April 22nd, 1915. So I like this map because it's very simple to understand. Here's Ypres, and directly west is Poppering out here in Flanders. And on April 22nd, they were given orders to get ready to go into battle. So they were on the road here from Vlamertinghe to Poppering. They were just waiting for orders and waiting and waiting. And all of a sudden, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they started seeing these French soldiers coming down here in absolute disarray. There'd be like 3 guys on one horse with, wagon harness on, or a dozen soldiers in a wagon, humping and bumping across farmers' fields here, guys falling out of the wagons. And they saw them first. Some of them had no caps. They were just in a mess. And then all of a sudden they started to get the smell of the gas. And that's when they realized it was chlorine. A German prisoner had told some English guys that captured him that they were going to do this, and they didn't believe it. They thought he was just trying to wind them up, but he was telling the truth. So they had about 5,000 canisters of gas all along their trench here. It was kind of a dumb idea because the prevailing wind goes from west to east, but very occasionally the wind changes and goes from east to west, and they got the wind they wanted. So they opened the valves on these canisters and released the gas. So this is what they call the Ypres salient here. This line was the British, the red line was the Canadians, and the blue line was the French. And really it was a lot of, probably mostly French colonial soldiers, Zouaves, Moroccans, Algerians, Senegalese, always, of course, under the command of French officers. And they got it the worst because it was released right here, Langemarck. It was released right here, and they just got absolutely shattered by the gas because they were, along the lines here. So the Canadians, what makes them so heroic to me in some respects is that they kind of strung themselves along here and kind of held the line when the entire French line broke. And John Mccrae actually wrote in his diary, they were on pins and needles thinking that because of the rout of the French here, that the Germans were going to get through. And incredibly, they never did. And a lot of that was down to the Canadians. But, it was a very chaotic, horrific battle. There wasn't proper communication. They didn't even have helmets at that point. They had the Ross rifle, which was heavy and jammed. It was a good sniper rifle, but it was a terrible rifle for everyday use in the field. So they really had a struggle in their trial by fire. So you may have seen paintings. In much of my research, I never saw a single photograph of Canadian soldiers in the Second Battle of Ypres. And it was really, there weren't war photographers over there yet. And all you ever got were these paintings, which were kind of fanciful, a lot of them. So this is meant to be Second Ypres. It's a painting by Richard Jack. Well, a friend of mine here in Victoria discovered a scrapbook in an antique store from a member of the 16th Battalion, Canadian Scottish. And it was fantastic. And this is another one of my most exciting discoveries of research. Meeting Steve Clifford is the guy's name who got this scrapbook. So all the photographs neatly laid out, amazing quality for their time, all labeled with white grease pencils. And here are the Canadian Scottish. So if any of you don't know too much about the Second Battle of Ypres, there was the gas. There was a famous battle within that battle called the Battle of Kitchener's Wood. And the 2 battalions that fought at Kitchener's Wood were the Can Scots here and the 10th Battalion, those 2 battalions from Calgary and Winnipeg, later to become the Calgary Highlanders. So this is just a fantastic picture. Here they are on the dike. The canal is just on the other side of these trees that goes into Ypres. And Mccrae and his brigade went in at the gallop and dug their guns in just before midnight on April 22nd. So I'm not sure exactly what the date of this is. But here's a sketch of John Mccrae's from a similar position. In this, you can see the Cloth Hall of Ypres in the distance. And here in Mccrae's sketch, here's the dike and the Cloth Hall as well. And I know that he saw these men. He saw lots of Canadian units going over these bridges and into battle, especially at nighttime on the night of the 22nd. So now here's the Battle of Kitchener's Wood. Now what happened with this battle is that they were under the command of an Alberta rancher named Russell Boyle, and they were told to dislodge the Germans from this oak forest just a little bit northeast of Ypres. And so they got ready to go. That there was German artillery in here, and they were well kind of ensconced in this oak forest. So they were sneaking across this field. They left their greatcoats behind them, and they were just going as quietly as they could until they came to a hedge that had a thick gauge wire going through it. And they started to rustle a little bit. And next thing, the very lights went up, the star shells that illuminated the whole place like daylight. And the Germans just opened up machine guns on them. Out of 1,500 men, the next morning, there was only about 800 or so left, combined of the two battalions. So it was, I mean, they took the wood, but at horrendous cost. But this is probably my favorite picture that I've seen in the last, I don't know, years. And this is from that album, Some of the Survivors. So this is after the Battle of Kitchener's Wood. And these are a few of the Can Scots who survived. And I just feel like some of them look almost giddy, like they can't believe that they even made it through. So this is an amazing picture for its time. And here they are standing on top of the dike, maybe gloating a little bit, but probably counting their lucky stars. Now, this is another really cool photograph I got way back in 2006. I was staying at a bed and breakfast called Varlet Farm, and some of you may know it if you go over there. I call it Research Central because you get all kinds of writers and guides. And there was a guy there one time I was there who was a professor at Sandhurst. Anyway, the curator of In Flanders Fields Museum heard that I was there and was researching John Mccrae. So he actually came to meet me at the B&B and gave me a CD with all these great pictures on it. And this is probably my other favorite. It's an aerial photograph taken by a German baron. We reckon about April 27th. So a few days after the battle has started. And the quality of this picture is just incredible. So here's Essex Farm down here at the bottom. Here's the canal, the Yser Canal. And where you saw those soldiers was probably on top of the dike somewhere along here. Here's old trenches. Some of them were dug in 1914. And this is where the official Mccrae monument is, and these cement bunkers here. And I would hear many guides talking about John Mccrae being here and treating wounded in these cement bunkers. But the fact is, he came and went from this area before the cement bunkers were even built. So he wasn't actually here when they were built. Where he was way up here, just before the bend in the canal up here, into the dike. Well, it's hard to say. He talked about a kind of a crossroads, so it could have been right around here. But he was dug in, started digging in the night of April 22nd on a moment's notice. So he described it as an 8-foot by 8-foot hole, and it was shored up with scraps of tin and wood. And that's where he did all his medical treatments of people. It was like, it was hard with blood by the end of 17 days. They were in this battle for 17 days straight without relief. So it was just a hell of a trial by fire for these artillery guys. So the half of 2 battery, which was Helmer's battery, was somewhere before the bend here. And it was never discovered by the Germans. Whereas, the express purpose of this flyover here was to pinpoint these batteries of John Mccrae's brigade. So they did hit a lot of them, and they lost about half their men. Most of the batteries were moving around all the time in this general area. But that one half of 2 battery was undiscovered here for the entire length of the battle. So here's where the gas came down, and it came down more than once. It came down several times. And Mccrae talked in his diary about, I remember one was April 26th. So that's 4 days after the initial release of the gas. Oh, shoot. Am I drawing on here? Anyway, this thing is drawing on here. That was 4 days after, yeah. And they were still letting the gas go, and he was suffering from it. So that was one of the things that affected his health adversely. That spur that you saw, they're made out of solid nickel, and they're usually silver. But that spur was discolored to a kind of a yellow hue. And I have a niece who's a scientist. I said, would chlorine do that? And she said, yes, it would. So, I think that spur was genuinely his. So, yeah, this is where they were for the duration of the battle. And now this dumb thing has caused me to be drawing lines on here that I don't want. Right here, there's a tiny graveyard with about 32 graves, which were expanding daily. And I think it's possible that Alexis Helmer could have been buried in there initially, and then it might have gotten blown out of the ground because, he was buried and had a cross over him. And by the end of the battle, he had kind of disappeared. And now the only thing left is his name on the Menin Gate. And shoot. Here's another photograph, a really great photograph of the Azer Canal and the band here. Now you can see the devastation. This is probably after or during the Third Battle of Ypres, which was 2 years later. So it had just gotten hammered. There wasn't a tree left or a windmill or a farm or anything left standing. Now this monument was erected in honor of those Canadians that held the line in the face of the first gas attack. So it was erected on July 23rd, I think, July 8th, 1923. And there was all kinds of VIPs and dignitaries there for that. Here's another picture of it. As it is, probably not even as it is today. They've done a major renovation with the trees and foliage around it. So it probably looks quite different now. I haven't been there since 2019, before the pandemic. So the next thing that happened is that Mccrae, they finished the Second Battle of Ypres. It went for them from April 22nd to about May 8th. And then they were marched straight down to Festubert with no rest. Like they went straight into another battle, which would have been unbelievably taxing. Most of their guns were damaged. They were trying to restore them on the move. And of course, Festubert was horrific. It was in the warmer weather. There'd been earlier fighting, so there was unburied bodies all over the place, which Mccrae talked about being most offended by. And I think all these things were, really taking a toll on him. So in the middle of the Battle of Festubert, they came along and they said, Mccrae, you're out of the artillery. We want you to be one of the top 3 people at number 3 Canadian General Hospital in McGill. There's going to be Colonel Burkitt, and Burkitt was the Dean of Medicine at McGill. And then there's going to be Colonel John Mccrae. They promoted him from major to lieutenant colonel, doctor in charge of medicine. So he would be the chief pathologist. And then the other guy was going to be, what was his name? Colonel Elder, doctor in charge of surgery. So he was not really happy about being taken away from his comrades in the middle of a battle. And if anybody knows combat veterans, that's always a terrible thing, to leave your mates in the field. And away you go to, especially in his case, more safe and cushy circumstances. So that did not sit well with him at all. And here's the first version of number 3 Canadian General. So it was in between these 2 villages, Dan and Camier, very close to the coast of France, just inside the dunes. And it was fine until the late fall and winter weather hit. And then it was a disaster. The gale force winds would come through, and there'd be these guys in tents, being exposed to the elements when the tents were literally ripped right off over their heads, and nurses trying to tie them down. If you can imagine heavy, wet canvas, it was a nightmare. So they immediately knew they had to find safer quarters, and they scouted around and they found a partially burnt Jesuit school up near on the Calais Road, and that was where they moved number 3 Canadian General Hospital to, and where they stayed right until the end of the war. So here's John Mccrae with his dog Bono, and the story goes that Bono belonged to the hospital caretakers, and as soon as he met Mccrae, he just ditched the caretakers and moved in to Mccrae's bell tent with him, and was just at his side, 24/7 till the very end. So he was one of the members of what Mccrae called his little family. And here's Edward Morrison. So Morrison, he continued to be promoted, and here he is in Passchendaele, and he was eventually promoted to be the general officer commanding all Canadian artillery. That was at the end of 1916, so he was the commander of the Canadian artillery from Vimy on. This was at Passchendaele, though, but at Vimy, he wrote Mccrae a letter, and he said, after the victory, he said, the only thing that could have made this more perfect is if you'd been here. So that was kind of touching. So here's Morrison here with I think this is the Vimy staff, and here's Byng. Now, Colonel Byng, or General Byng, I should say, took over the Canadians at the beginning of Mont-Sorel, which was a battle in the spring of 1916 before the Somme. And he helped to transform the Canadians into probably one of the best forces in the war. He really came to like them. At first, he was like, what do I do with Canadians? I don't even know any Canadians. But he kind of became very fond of them. And these two actually became quite fond of each other, Morrison and Byng, and stayed in contact after the war. So, yeah, Bonfire. Now, this is the other member of what Mccrae called his little family. Bonfire was given to him by a colleague from McGill, who was actually a tropical medicine specialist, but his wife was a famous equestrian, and they had a stable of really fine horses, and Bonfire was a fine horse. He was an Irish type thoroughbred, so not one of those skinny race horses that if you ride one, it's like sitting on a fence. He was one of those, big chest, big hindquarters, hunter jumper, and everyone admired Bonfire, and he was quite a celebrity in his own right. You see his tongue sticking out in this picture. While he was a character, he would pick off somebody's hat and then just walk away with it. And if they tried to get it from him, he'd hold it up high above their head or out of their reach, and then eventually would drop it on the ground. And Mccrae said he would carry his swagger stick for a quarter of a mile. He said, I have hopes of teaching him to retrieve. So I think the dog and the horse probably kept him somewhat sane until the end. He absolutely loved the pair of them. So this is an interesting picture to me. The time it was taken, he was actually in the hospital with pleurisy, and he's not wearing puttees here. He normally dressed with his puttees on. He's just got shoes on. And I just can imagine somebody went and grabbed him out of his bed where he was still recuperating and said, come on, we're getting a picture of officers and we want you in it. So he looks rather disheveled here. His hat is askew, and it's easy to, when you look at his record, to see that he was actually not well at this point. So here is the number 3 Canadian General Hospital. It was on 25 acres. Just want to check the time. It was on 25 acres. Number 16 here was Mccrae's bell tent. He became sort of martyr-ish. He wouldn't go into more cushy officers' quarters. He, even when he became quite ill, he had to be ordered finally into better quarters. He had to be ordered out of the artillery too, into the Canadian Army Medical Corps, because he never wanted to be in the Canadian Army Medical Corps. He had this opinion that stayed with him ever since the South African War. So yeah, the pathology lab was number 16 here, and it was just a little shack, really. But that's where he did his tests and gathered up his medicines for dispensing medicines. And he would go on rounds here with Bono, sometimes carrying a bone or a stick or whatever. And the matron was quite cool about it, and probably saw how good it was for the men to play with the dog, and they got a kick out of it. So he would write his nieces and nephews, I should say his nieces and nephew from the hospital with these postcards as Bonfire and as Bono, and sign them with a hoof print and a dog's paw print, which is kind of cute. But he was actually declining quite badly here, and people knew that he had shell shock. They said he is badly shell shocked. I think that nothing prepared him for the gravity of the wounds that he had to treat at the Second Battle of Ypres. Certainly nothing in the South African War had prepared him for the carnage of artillery in World War I. So here he is in the middle here. Queen Mary went on a tour of all the hospitals, and here's Queen Mary and Mccrae and Burkitt. And he actually got quite irritable about these tours because it took him away from his work. He was not the guy that he used to be with the, singing and telling funny stories. He had become quite morose by this time. And then Passchendaele happened, and they would have to clear all the walking wounded or anyone who could be moved out of the hospital to make way for the next onslaught, so that these were casualties of 3rd Ypres or Passchendaele outside the hospital waiting to be treated. So I had this picture colorized because I wanted to see Bonfire in his chestnut glory. Mccrae's nickname for him was the Chestnut Gentleman. So I actually got in trouble for doing this, but as you know, it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. So I just loved this picture because he was a beautiful horse, and everyone knew him. The kids knew him. The nurses all spoiled him with ginger snaps and sugar lumps and stuff like that. And these were the most important beings in Mccrae's life at the end. So I think one of the things that kind of hastened his demise is he knew Sir William Osler's son since he was a baby. And he used to regale him with all these swashbuckling artillery tales. Well, when World War I started, Ike here, they got him a cushy job as a quartermaster at the hospital, but no. He wanted nothing so much as to join the artillery. And somehow he got enough strings pulled to get into the artillery. These two were so close, and they were great friends. They went fishing together, played pranks on people. Here's young Ike in uniform, and Sir William Osler in uniform as well, which he thought was ridiculous, but they had him do it. And in one of the opening battles of 3rd Ypres, he was killed. So he's buried in Dozingham Cemetery, which is west again. It's about 6 kilometers west of Poppering, and it's a hospital cemetery. And there he lies at age 21. So Sir William Osler did not recover from that. He just went into a profound depression, and he died 2 years later. Quite young too, like 60, 62 or something. So Mccrae became ill at number 3 Canadian General. He kind of recovered, and then he went downhill again. So they took him to the number 14 British Officers Hospital down the road, where all these, top of their profession doctors were just hoping against hope that they could help him, but they couldn't. And so this is his funeral. It was one of the biggest funerals in all of World War I. Here's General Currie. Here's Morrison standing at Bonfire's head. Here's Mccrae's boots reversed in the stirrups, as is the tradition when a guy dies that is from a mounted unit. And there was 19 nursing sisters. Everybody was crying. They were just devastated. And I read a letter from the chief of surgery to Burkitt. Burkitt had to return to Montreal because he was unwell. And I was reading it all by myself. They opened the archives for me in Guelph at McRae House. And I was sitting there bawling in 2006, reading this heartbreaking letter. It was so immediate and so emotional. And that was his groom Dodge holding bonfire there. Do I have time? How am I doing for time, somebody? Anybody?
No, you're fine, Susan. Keep going.
Okay. Now, I don't know if any of you have been to Bologna. If you know the Colonne de Grande Armée with Napoleon at the top of it. Mccrae hated that thing, by the way. If you're facing Napoleon and you turn around the opposite direction, here's this beautiful, secluded area where Mccrae used to ride bonfire at night after days at the hospital. And it's just the same as it was. It's lined with blackberry bushes. He used to feed himself and bonfire handfuls of blackberries. And they're still there all along here are blackberry bushes. And if he haunts any place, I always say it's here. There's a bubbling stream and songbirds, and it was just a fantastic place for him to decompress. And at the head of it is this Estaminet Dixième Moulin. And he used to take dinner here sometimes, and he would tie bonfire to this railing here. And there was a wheel there, but not anymore, just kind of a waterfall. So people always ask about bonfire. He was supposed to be coming home on a ship back to John Todd, the guy that gave him to Mccrae. And Todd's wife, Marjorie, the equestrian, went to the docks to meet it. No sign of bonfire. He just never came off. So I was, everyone asks, what happened to bonfire? And I found out that Morrison brought his own horse back to Ottawa. I hadn't known that. And here's Morrison on King in the Grand Place in Mons on November the 11th, 1918. And here he is with General Currie riding over the Rhine. So when I realized how important King was to Morrison, everyone knew that bonfire was really important to Mccrae. So the first guy that wrote a little biography of Mccrae was Andrew MacPhail from McGill. He commanded a field ambulance unit in Loker, just near Kemmel Hill and Saltadeep. Major Andrew MacPhail. He wrote the first biography of Mccrae in 1919, so events were fresh. And I read it. It was one of the first things I read. But oops, you don't know what you're looking at. That early in the research, you don't know you can't put things in a context. So I was looking through it again like 10 years later. And here MacPhail says, bonfire is honorably and secretly retired in a place that the brass hats need not know about, because it would have been illegal or against regulations for them to do anything but put bonfire into a remount depot for another officer, or God forbid, hauling guns or something like that. So I'm like 99% positive that these officers probably pooled their money and paid some French farmer to secretly retire bonfire, because they would have done that. I know they would have. And I always say pardon the expression, my ass backwards proof of that is that none of them have ever uttered a word about it. That's how I know. So I think bonfire was retired safely after Mccrae died. So I researched Mccrae and I just went to great lengths to research, and I wrote a 120-page screenplay. Naively thought, who's not going to make a movie about our hero? But nope, that wasn't happening. So all of a sudden, one of my favorite books as a kid was Black Beauty. And I decided, how about if we learn Mccrae's story have bonfire show us who Mccrae was and tell the essential story behind the writing of In Flanders Fields. So that's what I did. So this was the first book I wrote about John Mccrae. It's a hardcover with glossy pages. It was a true labor of love. And the archival photographs, it's obviously historical fiction because the horse is telling the story, but it's based on real history. There's about 25 archival photographs in there, and they look beautiful on the glossy pages. So that's what I did with all that stuff. I distilled it down to an accessible, digestible story. And really, everybody from teenagers to World War II vets in their 90s loved the story. And the guys that produced Murdoch Mysteries, Shaftesbury Films in Toronto, pitched it to CBC as a movie. So that's a good endorsement of the story. But sadly, CBC had just had cuts, so it never became a movie, but I'm still hopeful. So on my motorcycle, I went to Wimereux, where Mccrae is buried. And this was just a day in June, not a particular anniversary of any kind. And this is how you find his grave quite often, just surrounded with all kinds of tributes from all kinds of countries, not just Canadians, but British and South African and Kiwis. I mean, he was loved and he's not forgotten. So it's nice to know that. Now I'm going to fade to black here, and then I just have two more quick things after that. I'm sorry about the squiggles. I don't know if you can see those, but I don't know how that happened. So in July of 2023, there's going to be a big commemorative event in near Langemark, where this monument is. And I got to know, I was researching the creator of this monument. It's like he dropped off the planet after the war, kind of resurfaced when they erected the monument here because he was in a competition. Vimy came first and he came second in that competition. And then he disappeared. Well, I did a bit of detective work and I found that he had a living daughter. I couldn't have been more excited. So I interviewed her in California and she provided me with all these great pictures. So I'm going to be at that commemorative event, and I've convinced the creator of the sculpture, I've convinced his grandson to come as well. So that's going to be really exciting to have an actual relative of the guy that created that. Now, I can't imagine Isabel Clemishaw Kimball will live to 2023, but you never know. She's still going at 96, I think. This is me admiring one of my favorite monuments over there. So I also wrote a book about that too. I got all these great pictures from her. Nobody had ever seen this guy in uniform before. So I had that colorized as well because he had reddish brown hair and blue eyes. So anyway, that's my last bit of detail. And if anyone has any questions, I would welcome them.
Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, now's your time. I suppose too, Susan, there were a lot of horses, that was one thing. The men got really attached to the horses. My own father was in the Royal Horse Artillery as a young man, and I remember him telling me how attached they got to the horses, and some of them were killed, killed in action.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They even had a handbook called the Blue Cross Handbook, which they gave to all the horse holders and grooms about how to look after horses as well as possible, how to massage their ears and their legs and how to quiet them. So they were very diligent about how they cared for the horses, contrary to what a lot of people believe,
So has anybody got any questions? Anything at all? I think we're just stunned at such a tremendous presentation.
Oh, well, thank you.
Very passionate. Well, if there's no questions, I just have to thank you for really an articulate and very articulate and outstanding presentation with some amazing photos. I don't know how long it took you to assemble all that many, but my goodness, I was quite surprised. Now, we all know the famous poem and the name of Dr. Mccrae, and now we know the story of the history of the man behind it. So thank you very, very much. It's truly a fascinating presentation. And at this time, I want to thank RCMI member Dr. Andrew Beckett for suggesting you. Thank you, Andrew, wherever you are. Thank you. It's really wonderful. So, and at this time, I usually present a speaker with a gift of appreciation, but it's not possible. So Canada Post is going to do the job for me. So,
okay, great.
Yeah, keep an eye out on your post box. And I'd also like to thank at this time the behind the scenes team of RCMI for their support this evening, without which this presentation would not be possible. And also our host, Tanisha, and Eric Morse, who provides our videos of all our events. Thank you all. Thank you. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Thank you again, Susan. I'm really and truly, it was an amazing presentation. And thank you for your presentation, ladies and gentlemen. I now declare this meeting ended.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.